Welcome, everyone. My name is Achyut, and I will be your moderator. Pook is our speaker tonight, and he will be helping us get answers for the top burning questions from practitioners across the country. Is now the golden opportunity to relocate your practice, or to leverage the current real estate market opportunities to get a better deal for your current landlord? If at any point you have a question, please type it into the box labeled "Have a Question," and we will conduct a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. To talk with other attendees, navigate to your control panel at the bottom of your screen and click the chat icon. Henry Schein is not offering CE credit for viewing or attending this presentation, live or on demand. Eric, welcome.
Perfect. Thanks, Achyut. Appreciate being here. Good evening, everybody. Looking forward to really one of the favorite topics that we get a chance to lecture on, which is really taking the first step, which you have this evening, which is looking a little differently at the market today. And when there's so much uncertainty, right now we're talking rapid inflation, we've got interest rates coming up, there's talk of the R word. And you know what, tonight's a great opportunity to look a little differently. And first of all, look at the past 2 years. Right? If nobody's giving you a true pat on the back in appreciation for the great work that you've done, it can be very difficult being a business owner, let alone a global pandemic, let alone being in healthcare. So, let alone the sole breadwinner for many of you in your individual practices. So the fact that you're attending tonight shares a few things. One is that you have achieved some great capacity. And now there's capacity issues. So not only have you weathered the storm, but you've actually thrived through the process, which is, again, fantastic in comparison to many other businesses, retail, florists, et cetera, otherwise, that have not fared so well. As well as it's perhaps many of you have also attended because you're now thinking, well, heck, I know I'm not going to be able to sell my practice where I'm at today. Is now the right time to bite the bullet to contemplate the relocation? Or what would my landlord be willing to do to keep me to stay? Or is it the right time for me to move and potentially buy a piece of real estate? So needless to say, it's been a great opportunity to be lecturing through the Dental Academy and helping to demystify and look at situations a little differently. So encourage you to happy to answer as many questions as we can through the Q&A, really keeping things interactive. Obviously, we've had no shortage of Zooms over the past 2 years, but luckily we continue to be one of the top rated and really getting into some great practical case studies, examples, and happy to discuss any individual situations either in a group setting here or offline afterwards. So from that perspective, you'll see a poll here pull up in a moment. And again, to help customize the content for this evening, share with me a little bit about your current situation. So there's 5 buckets here. The first is, are you planning to open or relocate a practice? Right? Number 2 is, are you planning to acquire a practice? Number 3 is, are you planning to transition or sell the practice within the next 5 years? Number 4, hey, you know what, Eric, I just want to stay put, wait, right? And just simply hunker down and renegotiate my lease and figure out where the storm goes, or none of the above. So take a quick moment to select which one is most applicable for you. I've had the privilege of speaking to over 1,000 doctors over the past 2 years through a variety of different scenarios, arguably all scenarios, from some doctors who unfortunately passed away and were dealing with their spouses, in other cases, dealing with doctors that were just wanted to walk away and just could not handle the stress that was COVID, from practicing actual pre-latex wet finger dentistry all the way through to then walking in feeling like we're in full PPE, feeling like the Michelin Man going in. So that's poll number 1. And based on that, we'll help to really see, again, how we can help assist. From number 2, now the scenarios can impact this. You might be shocked to know how much the landlord contributes and can help through your expansions, renovations, relocations, and actually flip the bill for a number of these types of expenditures. So we'll go through a lot of these tips and tricks here shortly. But when does your lease expire? Has it already expired, right? And you're in a month-to-month tenancy? If so, then there'll be an upcoming poll towards the end to denote if your situation's urgent. And I would strongly suggest that your situation is urgent, because if you are in a month-to-month tenancy, it does create a ton of risk. Yes, you have the option to give notice to the landlord and walk away within 30 days, but the landlord could equally put a little brown envelope on your door and you would have the same 30 days to vacate. Right? So think about it for that for a second. If the landlord exercise their right to either relocate, demolish the building, or just give you 30 days to vacate, what would you do? Who would you call? So it really does help to shape a different perspective. For those of you that the lease is due within the next 2 years, very important to look at that a little differently. You now have much more leverage than you might have thought possible. And if the landlord has played the usual game to say, you know what, come back and see me in 3 months, prior to expiry, well, it's too early, right? Then you've just fallen into the trap that is, unfortunately, the landlord's game, which is to delay, defer as much as possible, knowing that it can be upwards of 18 months right now to relocate a dental practice. Is your lease due in the next 2 to 5 years, over 5 years, or I own my building, or perhaps you're new and don't have a lease today? From that perspective, also a quick yes or no question here. For those of you that had reached out, thank you. A number of you had sent me an email previously. Again, if you have or have not had a chance to sort of reflect or look at your lease, or really just looking for an opportunity to have a one-to-one conversation, there's a quick yes, and that'll be able to set up a quick 15-minute consult with myself or one of the senior members of my team to help ensure that we've got a good strategy understanding. And so at least you have the facts in terms of your current lease options, and even what rental rates or availabilities are near you as well. So a quick yes or no on there. Okay, so tonight, truly some great opportunities to touch on. And I wanted to start with this, 3 numbers that will astound you. The first, 85% of dentists have a lease today, post-COVID, that can prevent them from ever being able to sell their practice. Now, even more so post-COVID, here we are in mid-2022, 54% of dentists across North America are overpaying in rent. And it makes sense, right? If you bought a practice from a doctor 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and they received some free rent, or one file I was looking at in South Carolina, they received 12 months worth of free rent, and then the doctor went around and sold it a year later. Well, it was well above market. So the landlord obviously just kicked the can, deferred some of that income, and then dramatically increased rental rates, not only for the balance of the 10-year term, but for the 2 5-year options thereafter. And every time the doctor renewed the rent, it kept going up and up and up. We recently did a lease negotiation in Vista, California, and we were able to secure the doctor over 30% reduction in rent because they were on the world's most boring roller coaster, right? And just kept on going up and up and up versus where market was. And again, if you thought the market, you had a good sense of where the market was, you'd be shocked to see what things have occurred even just within the past few months, now that there's annual increases with inflation questions, etc. All right. And then last but not least, 80% of landlords have and structure the lease that can entitle them to receive up to 50% of the practice sale proceeds. Meaning that, yes, the landlord, in exchange for them assigning the lease and transferring that lease over to a buyer, the landlord has the complete and full right to get a percentage of your practice sale proceeds. So if I piqued your interest and you're digging through your online and looking for a digital copy of the lease, feel free to follow along with the lease. We're going to go through some practical examples there as well. So purpose, process, and payoff for this evening. Number one is, let's get some of the answers. What are other doctors doing? What are those that have the Rockefeller approach that in uncertain times, how are they helping to adjust their sails in potential future stormy seas? And how do we help to really make sure that we are building on the great momentum that you've created in your practice, right? Or alternatively, if you're now to a situation where, you know what, gosh, I don't know if I can withstand another 6 months, 12 months or beyond, what are my options, right? You'd also be surprised in terms of what landlords may or may not be able to do to help support you through some of those wild times. Again, for many, it has been a true golden opportunity and perhaps the kick that some needed to look down the street. And those that have, I can think of 2 clients in Vermont, I can think of another great doctor we just did in Boston, where really they were just on the fringe thinking of, you know what, I'll probably stay, but maybe, just maybe I should look down the street to see with that landlord who has that nice new strip mall, right, or medical dental building, etc. Maybe now's the time just to see what they'd be willing to do to entice a existing established dentist to then come on to, right, their side to attract your high quality foot traffic. And if I can pause for a second and say that you, doctors, are the absolute best tenants on the planet. Let me say that again. You are the best tenants on the planet. You have the highest build-out costs. Right now, not uncommon to see upwards of $300 per square foot. Some in the Bay Area are paying upwards of $400 per square foot. Number one, big investment. Number two, low default rate. Right? Currently, it's roughly a 0.5% default rate, that after 10 years, the likelihood that a dentist is no longer in that space, versus a restaurant that recent stats have shown is close to 95% that restaurant is not going to be there 10 years later. Right? Plus, you have the highest quality foot traffic coming through, and whether you agree with me or not, you are COVID proof, meaning that there's not a single dentist that's been able to work from home. So therefore, as all these other businesses and high tech and the layoffs and everything else that's been going on, Facebook, Meta, whatever they're calling it these days, right? As they're looking differently, you as a tenant, right, provide a whole lot more leverage than you have. So on that note, quick background on us. We've been now 27 years in the business. We've done over 13,000 successful lease negotiations. And we're pretty unique. We're the only hyper-specialized dental tenant representation firm of our kind in North America. This is it. This is all we do. We have an incredible legal and leasing team. Some of our lease negotiators have been with us over 20 years, which is, again, truly unique, being hyper-specialized, helping doctors buying or building their first practice, right? Mid-career doctors expanding, renovating, relocating their practices, or simply renewing. Right? Doctors preparing for eventual transition to renegotiate their leases, or of course, a lot of our work is also working with those who own their own real estate to help make sure that there's a proper lease structured between the two. So let's look at this a little differently now. And again, as a reminder, feel free to Q&A. If you've got some burning questions as we go, happy to cover it as we run through. All right, so number one, as you've gone through COVID, ask yourself a couple of questions. Did you make alterations to the space already? Now, think through, was there anything you brought in a contractor for, right? Was there anything that was done that could impact the airflow for the space, right? Was that, and most importantly, was there a provision in your lease that required you to notify the landlord of any sort of alteration? And you might think, you know what, I just cordoned off some of the opportunities, some of the ops, and just, put some plastic separation in between the operatories, etc. But again, the landlord puts provisions in the lease because there might be things outside of what you're aware of, right? Let it be airflow for fire and smoke detection, right? and other aspects that you might not, the landlord's concerned about, you might not have thought of that, and be cautious, right? Because if you did make any sort of alterations or changes through COVID or otherwise without the landlord's consent, you really want to look through the alteration section of your lease. Other questions were rent deferrals, rent abatements. Has that been all trued up now? Is there clarity from the landlord? Is there any deferred payments that are still outstanding that haven't been properly documented? But ultimately, doctors, look, the practice is, right, the foundation of your business. Ask yourself, right, if tomorrow morning you drove to the office, you turned the key, and the key didn't work, right? What's your practice worth, right? What if you needed to sell it? And as the practice brokerage team at Henry Schein always talks about, is the emergency exit, right? So what would your emergency exit be? Heaven forbid something were to happen to you. These are all things to consider now as you're contemplating expansion, renovation, or relocations, right? And it's expensive, right? There's no quibs or quos about it. It is expensive now to make the investment. However, right, as many have gotten out of the space and retired, especially on the baby boomer side, right, there is a great opportunity for the next generation of dentists to be able to capitalize on that transition and grow through investment, right, online strategies, marketing strategies, and to build, right, beautiful practices that can help see them all the way through the eventual transition and sale. So don't get too wound up on the initial investment. The likelihood is you're going to recoup that and more upon your eventual sale, and we'll touch on that as well. So cost we touched on, and the expense and time consuming, right? So you've got to have the facts. The facts are, you really want to understand the best possible deal to stay. What's that landlord willing to do to keep me, right, here in my practice and here in their building, right? Or, and more interestingly in some cases, what's that landlord down the street willing to do to have me bring my entire book of business, right, and high quality foot traffic and bring it into their mall? The practice sale, I touched on that before. The lease is the number one reason why a practice sale fails at the 11th hour. Is the lease, the assignment of the lease, the landlord, who now is much more difficult than they have been in the past, knowing how much dental practices are being sold for. The practice saleability is key. And a poorly structured lease, some will prevent, if it says in your assignment and subletting section that the landlord, right, under no circumstances will approve or the lease is not assignable, right, we have a problem. And certainly what you want to look for is if it states that the landlord cannot unreasonably withhold, delay, or even condition, right, the sale of the practice. So we'll touch on a practical example of that coming up. And last but not least is leverage, right? Don't underestimate your value to the landlord, and just look at the financials. Look at the base rent that you're paying today. Look at the triple net expenses that you're paying today. Multiply that over the next 5 or 10 years. Look at a 3, 4, or some landlords are pushing now for a 7% annual increase in rent. I know some of you are shivering with that, right? That's what we're seeing today. So it gives you a lot of leverage as you're dangling through that check, right, is a major component, right? Don't underestimate your value to the landlord. Okay, so now a great takeaway here is looking at leverage and how to make that work for you. So these are just some, but these are 7 of my favorite financial negotiables to work with a landlord. So a couple of components here. First off, the base rent goes without saying. One of the things that we've done, and as the president of the business here and the managing partner, we've invested in all the commercial real estate data from Anchorage to Honolulu to Key West, right, Halifax, and everything in between. So knowing long before you start the negotiations what, right, other dental deals have done in the area, right, which is helpful. Number two is what market looks like for other comparable practices or locations in the area. Right? And then certainly number three, what the vacancy rates are, what the months on market are, right? And how much some of these landlords have been squeezed through COVID and now concerned about other types of tenants moving out and the risk associated with that. And annual increases. So yes, have a look through your leases. There can be a few different ways it was structured, and hindsight's always 20/20. It could be CPI. It could be consumer price index. It's how much the annual increase will increase year over year, right? That made a lot of sense 5-10 years ago when it was 1%, 0.5%, etc. Right? But now, as we're seeing a lot more, that could easily be 3, 4, 5, 6, 7% in terms of annual increases. Is there a cap to your annual increase? Some, not all, some landlords may be open to that. Or was it just a set rate? Was it a 3% or 4% or 5%? Right? We've had some great success recently helping to iron out some of those. So especially 6 months ago, hey, we don't know when the next wave is, as my 5-year-old says, Megatron, right? Omicron, Megatron, whatever the heck is coming up next, right? We just don't know. So in some cases, we've kept the lease fixed for the first 3 years, then an adjustment, fix it for another 3 years, another adjustment, right? Fix it for another 3 to 4 years. So what it does is when actually looking at the effective rate over the term, we really have ironed out those annual increases, which, heck, even a 0.5% reduction can save you tens of thousands of dollars, right? Just over the next 5 to 10 years. CAM, common area maintenance. This is unfortunate, but on our website, we have a fantastic blog post where we touched on all the key methods that can be negotiable within the financial components of the lease. And CAM is one that's frequently overlooked. Right? It's some of you, you're paying a third, maybe even a half of what your rental rates are today going towards CAM. Some, unfortunately, new practitioners, my rent is $41 per square foot, not knowing that there's all this triple net coming in behind it, taxes, maintenance, insurance. Why the heck am I paying that? I thought that was a landlord's expense. All depends on the lease. But adding a CAM cap, right? Not unprecedented, but now a little more difficult with all the landlord's fears of inflation, etc. But CAM is certainly one that there could be some exclusions, right? Why should you have to pay for legal or brokerage fees for other units that have nothing to do with you? Right? How much are you paying for the landlord's maintenance or management fees? Right? And ultimately, are you paying for other expenses that really have nothing to do with your unit, right? Or the benefit to the unit? Fixturing and free rent, number 4 and number 5. These are great ones. Fixturing is the period from the time you get the keys for your relocation to the time that you're up and running, right? And so that fixturing time, it is very common to negotiate that fixturing period, which is in essence free rent. It's not, but it gives you the opportunity to not pay base rent as you're fixing up the space. Why should you have to pay double rent from where you are today if the whole time you're purely trying just to get up and running? So a fixturing period is not uncommon, and try to stretch that out as much as possible. Why would you want to start paying rent before you're actually up and running? Now, you've got to find some middle ground with a landlord, but those are certainly some things that we found some great headway, especially over the past few months. And we've got a couple of hundred active negotiations going on currently that I'm sort of referencing through anecdotally. Free rent is another one. So after month 1 of rent, right, month 2, month 3, the banks are going to be very focused on your expenditures. So the ability to defer rent or to get actual free rent, 1, 2, 3 months at $0, gives a great opportunity to, in essence, free up that cash flow, right, and give yourself as much wiggle room if you can, and decrease the amount of financing you need as you're getting the new location up and running. Tenant improvement allowance. I'm going to share a great example in Boston recently where the landlord covered over $290,000 worth of tenant improvement allowance. It is staggering what some landlords would be willing to do to attract, retain, right? Or in essence, bring in the valuable dental tenant into their space. Some are just done with retail and really want to have more rock solid medical dental. And then landlord work, right? The ability to have the landlord and their contractors incur some of the costs, let it be for a ADA compliant bathroom or otherwise. All those types of things are key. Again, for those of you that are following along, our email's there, right? If you haven't had it professionally reviewed, definitely it's something to do so in the near future. Okay, so the how, right? So I touched on a few of these, but stop, please. If for an instant you feel that you are, actually, let's do this, right? This is, on 24 is pretty new. Let's do a pulse check. So you got a thumbs up or thumbs down, okay? So thumbs up if you feel that you now have more leverage in your upcoming negotiation, and thumbs down if you feel that you have less leverage with your landlord. And you can be honest, right? Give it a quick, again, thumbs up if you feel that you have more leverage, right? Thumbs down if you think you have less. We'll give that a minute because I know there's a lag through there. But again, you are the best tenant on the planet. Start putting yourselves in the landlord's shoes, right? For many of you that are already given a thumbs down, put yourselves in the landlord's shoes for a second, right? They've got a significant mortgage, which is coming up for renewal, and that mortgage is going to be a whole lot more expensive than it was before. So that landlord's got to find a way to recoup those costs. What are they typically going to do? They're going to squeeze their tenants as much as they can. So they're going to either take the low road or the high road, right? Interesting. Over 5 times of you are more pessimistic, feeling that you have less leverage through the process. So not uncommon, right? But don't forget, a lot of that is the landlord's positioning, right? The fact that, I've got a dozen people that are going to take over your space and, take it or leave it. Or to feel that you just, hey, look, I've already built out my space. I'm already pot committed. I'm at their mercy. But again, do the math. You now represent a check for over $1.5 million over the next 10 to 20 years. That is a massive value, right? Not to be taken lightly. So the proper strategies there are really to help plan, prepare, prioritize, and stop. For all of those of you, right, 5 times as many that put a thumbs down, right, take this as the opportunity to ensure that if you feel that you're on this teeter-totter with the landlord and you're just dangling with your feet up in the air, right, get help, right, and make sure that you feel and you've got someone that does it to help ensure that you have a fair and equal footing with the landlord. Good, we've got some more optimists here. So not uncommon, right? I appreciate your honesty, but don't underestimate that and use it to your leverage. Be cautious what you share and when, especially as it pertains to expansions or renovations or relocations. If the landlord knows you're doing well, they've just found one of their first targets to squeeze, right, to make up for their higher mortgage expenses. Right? And then have your cake and eat it too. My advice is do both. So again, for those of you thinking of expanding, I'll stop our pulse check here. For those of you thinking of expanding, right, or renovating, do both. Meaning, I'm not saying, right, renovate and keep your existing practice and add all these practices, but I'm saying negotiate like hell to get the best possible deal for your current location, right? While also, right, putting your fishing pole in the water, right? As I was talking to a good client in West Virginia, right? Put your fishing pole in the water and try to find what the best deal is from other landlords down the street. If nothing else, just to keep your current landlord honest, right? And then again, now may be the time to finally be that nudge to say, look, I'm not going to be able to sell my practice here, right, in this location. So maybe now is the time to take advantage of low rates, again, comparatively very low, right, with the thought that it's going to continue to increase. So maybe now is the time to get some pretty inexpensive money, especially for those that look back that may have built out their practice in the early 80s at 15, 18%. A lot has changed. So For those of you, and I know a number of you had reached out that own their own real estate. So again, I get this question a lot. So now, Eric, what do I do next? So I've been leasing my practice for 22 years. I've raised some capital. I know now is a bit of an unusual time to be investing in real estate. Of course, everybody in real estate can make enough money. It just depends how long you live, right? And do you really want to tie up that amount of capital? So there can be pros and cons. Obviously, look, buying real estate, big upfront cost, right? You tie up a fair bit of capital with that. And if interest rates continue to rise, right, and your revenue for the practice doesn't rise at an equivalent rate, right, that can obviously be worse off. You are your landlord. You have then the rental income. You have some of the flexibility, right? And again, you've got the control of the property. But with that, you're also taking on typically another full-time job. And that is, it can be significant. You are now the landlord, especially if there's another tenant, right? If the pipes burst, if the roof, right? If the parking lot goes, all of this now becomes your problem. There's no one else to call. The value, right, of having a high foot traffic, high volume type of location and leasing is you have that flexibility. And it gives you the flexibility to say, hey, you know what, if this is not a great long-term fit, or if it's not aligned with the demographics that I want to do, perfect. I'll just transition out, move, which is obviously why, part of the reason why you may have joined this evening. So leasing does give you a fair bit of benefits and options, right? And it does provide usually some premium locations as you look at it. And again, having that flexibility to look to change. But in either case, the lease is so important. So one quick point for those of you that own your own real estate, it's very, very, very important that there is a proper dental structured lease between the two. You really want to start to think about asking yourself the question, if I passed away today, what is the state of my estate? Do I have my practice in a corporation? Do I have my building in a separate corporation? Right? And then number two is, if I did pass, or if you did retire, do you want to keep that real estate as a passive form of rental income, especially if your buyer can't afford $1 million for the practice and another $500,000 or $1 million for your building, right? Which is much more common. Typically, we'll see that the buyer will stay on and lease with a right to purchase, right, or a right of first refusal, if in the event they do want to buy 5 or 10 years later, so that they at least can get caught up so they're not taking on such a mountain of debt. And that can also be beneficial from a tax perspective. In addition, right, looking forward, you've got all the liability components. So doctor, if you were to keep ownership of the building, right, or even if, heaven forbid, someone were to slip and fall or otherwise, is there a clear delineation as to the responsibilities of the practice versus the responsibilities of, right, your building? And then also taxes and audits is important. If in the event you're not paying yourself fair market rent and you're over or underpaying to the detriment of Uncle Sam, is obviously a major issue and a lot of headaches that probably after everything you've been through, that's the last thing you need. Right? And then also, are you clearly delineating the books? Right? Are you using the same credit card to fix the roof or fix the plumbing as you are to buy a new handpiece from Schein? These are the type of questions to ask. If not, right, then again, your financials could be quite garbled. And when it comes time to valuing your practice, right, and valuing your building, if they're not properly separated, then again, it's a bit of a guess. And many buyers will be cautious because they just don't have the faith that in fact it's accurate. Okay, again, as a reminder, feel free to add some Q&A. Good to see some come through. Okay, so let's look at some case studies here. So this was one that I thought I'd share recently. So this is, again, pretty unique here. This is a doctor who hired us to simply renegotiate her lease, and just to keep the landlord honest, what we wanted the opportunity to do was to see what the landlord would be looking to do down the road. So we reached out to a landlord, found that they were incredibly anxious to secure an existing successful dental tenant, and were able to generate $284,000 worth of tenant improvement allowance. We were able to secure over $33,000 worth of free rent, 6 months to build out the new practice, right? Free of rent is the fixturing period, right? Options. So not only was there a 10-year term, but also 2 5-year options. For many of you, if you haven't bought or sold or dealt with the banks recently, Bank of America or otherwise, if there's insufficient term on the lease, they are very unlikely, and most will not issue a loan if there's not sufficient term on the lease, i.e., they're not going to give you $1 million loan when there's only 3 years left on the lease, right? The risk is too great that you might not be there and suddenly needing even more money, right, to now pick up and relocate and after putting the business in jeopardy. So having the options transferable to your buyer becomes incredibly important. Options are great for the tenant, right? But also even better for your buyer. Releasing of liability after the sale. So very common that for those of you following along in your leases, there will be a continuing liability clause that basically states that even after you've sold and transitioned, right, you will still be purely responsible for that lease, just as you are today. Right? Think about that. You've now sold, you've retired. We had a doctor in Michigan, sold, retired, not too far away from my folks in Sarasota. Right? The call came in a few years later, right, as they were enjoying retirement, and suddenly the doctor, the landlord, had reached out to him to say, "Unfortunately, doctor, right, the doctor you sold to has defaulted 3 months behind in rent, and we can't find him. Gone." Right? So you now are responsible for not only the $4,000 a month, but also the remaining 6 and the back rent, for the remaining 6.5 years left on the lease. Can you imagine getting that phone call? Right? So getting that release of liability, very important. Far easier to do mid-career than it is, right, as you're getting closer and closer to retirement. And then obviously we were able to help protect them from the landlord not be having any right to practice sale proceeds, no requirement to return it to pre-dental condition. Let me pause there for a second. Very, very common that for any renovation you do, the landlord has the opportunity to have you, force you to bring it back to whatever it looks like today. If it's gray shell and you did a tour today, right, and that's a new location, that's exactly what the landlord can require you to return it to based on the restoration requirement within the lease. So prime example, $316,000. This was a great example from the client, right, where we were able to help through in the midst of COVID, right, to be able to secure some fantastic savings and really do a great opportunity to help support the client. Another great one, this was in California, 74 years of age, right? This doctor was a personal client of mine. She was, tried to sell her practice 3 separate times, to her partner, 1 to her associate, right? And 1 just on the open market. Each time the landlord came back and said no. He, right, owned a restaurant, wanted her space. It was a nice end cap, lots of natural light, it was beautiful, right? 74 years of age. She couldn't sell her practice, right? All because the landlord said no, and all because of the stupid lease. Right? So bottom line is she was forced to move, right? She's just recently moved. Luckily, we were able to find a landlord about 10 minutes up the road, and the landlord was willing to build it out at their expense, their contractors, their expense to the landlords, to the doctor's specifications, right? We removed continuing liability. We made sure it was a pure sale, but it was a full relocation just to sell the practice. Again, can you imagine at 74 years of age, at the end of such a long, hard career, fighting day in and day out, staff issues, etc., to have to deal with that at the very end? So again, proactive can be a major improvement. Again, great 5-star review that we've done with our client, and again, very, very pleased to help her out. Another example. So this was, a client that ran, as many of you do, right? Ran it with your significant other, her husband, a former corporate lawyer, right? They knew the law, leasing, etc. But again, it wasn't specialized in dental leasing, right? Worked with, right, us to specifically help to ensure that there was renewal and expansion, right? And just through that process, we were able to secure roughly 15 times the cost of a return on the investment, right? Through tenant improvement allowance, decreased rental payments, and then we decreased personal guarantees, right? The landlord's ability to go after any of their personal assets, right? And themselves. Removed continuing liability, removed the right to sale proceeds upon sale, the demo clause. If you have a demo or relocation clause, that is a major red flag for your future buyer. Let it be 2 years, 5 years, or 20 years from now when you plan to sell, right? That should be addressed now and not closer to the time of sale. But we were able to get it removed in its entirety, and we also added some additional options, the use clause and also exclusivity, so that they were the only doctor and GP in the mall. And even if a specialist wanted to move in, they needed to get the doctor's approval of any potential competition. And we also removed the landlord's right to return it to pre-dental condition at the end. Okay, so just quickly, again, great examples of some incredibly happy clients, right? In Iowa, right? Des Moines, mid-career orthodontist looking to negotiate a long-term deal, current practice, right, to prepare for a remodeling. So one of the biggest suggestions are, if you're thinking of remodeling, don't do it yet without factoring in the lease. Because think about it, if you're about to invest even 10 grand, 50 grand, right? And then the landlord, first of all, you can't typically make any changes to the space without the landlord's prior consent, number one. Number two is, typically the landlord can require you to return it to pre-dental condition, or more importantly, if you do spend the 50 grand and then come to the landlord in 2 or 3 years and say, oh, I guess my lease is up for renewal, what do you think the landlord's going to do? They're going to laugh and say, hey, you're not going anywhere. Here's a 20-30% rent increase because thanks for the great renovation. That made my asset even more valuable. And thanks for spending all the money, right? You've lost so much of your leverage. So even if you're 5 years into a 10-year term and you're contemplating a significant renovation or expansion, right, you still have a lot of leverage, and the landlord might even be open to a brand new 10-year term and 2 5-year options, right? So prime example, twist of events, the doctor decided to take advantage of the leasing market opportunities due to the vacancy rates in Des Moines, right? COVID, moved to a new location, right? So instead of expanding, found a better opportunity to relocate. We were able to, right, get the financial agreements and the whole lease negotiation for the new location completed within 48 hours. Our poor lawyer spent sleepless nights to get this deal done, and pretty incredible that it got done within 48 hours. We were able to secure very fair rents, right? And the landlord agreed to literally all requests from the doctor. They just were so excited to have a dentist on board. They removed the landlord's right to a percentage of practice sale proceeds, and there was a full release of liability after the sale, removing of the personal guarantee, which for a new doctor in a new location, very, very unheard of, very difficult to remove that right away, and added exclusivity and options. So again, even those of you that might be in more rural locations, don't underestimate your leverage. I'm going to do another one here, right? Another pulse check. How are you feeling now? Looking at some recent examples, are you feeling more confident with your leverage, right? Or is it still the same or less, right? Thumbs up or a thumbs down, just to make sure everyone's still paying attention. So hopefully we've got a few more thumbs up, because again, these are doctors that came into these situations feeling a little disheartened, right? Yet with the proper structuring guidance and leveraging other similar dental deals with the area, we came up with some beautiful end results, right? Here's a doctor practicing 13 years, right? An adjoining suite next door to the doctor became available, right? Unique opportunity to move through. This was an interesting opportunity where the current lease was expiring in 3 years, right? They were cautious, but again, smart. They engaged the landlord first. Okay, good. At least we're closer to 50-50 now in terms of the pulse check. Thank you. The doctor came to Cirrus looking for some help, right? We were able to secure the new lease, secure a new, right, 10-year term, and do what we call a blend and extend. Blend and extend, which is a great technique to look at expanding the square footage, right, blending in the lease rate, and helping to use that now that you are a larger tenant in the space. So, as a result, a 12-year lease with 4 5-year options. So that's 32 years of term that the landlord, can't kick them out. So really helping to secure a great opportunity that for the doctor that wanted to sell in 5 or 10 or maybe 15 years, that new doctor has all the time in the world to pay off their loans, get ahead of themselves. It's just a yellow brick road that gives them a great path to future success. So for those of you without term or options, it is certainly something that you want to fix now, long before, typically 5 to 10 years prior to you're planning to sell and transition. Again, in the essence of time, lots of great examples. In this case, be cautious of the fine print. There was a construction supervision fee that was for a total percentage of what the doctor was going to be paying for, to literally have the landlord supervisor stand there and pay astronomical rates, right, for a supervision fee, release of liabilities, no sale proceeds, etc. Right, and this was again one of the worst lease terms we had seen, and we were able to completely turn that around. Great, I'm glad to see we've got more thumbs up than thumbs down. So let's talk about the how now, as we wrap up through here. Right, here's the how. So first of all, know your specifics. This is a scenario where here are all the clauses and just some that we focus on through the renegotiation. If you're not sure of which ones are in your lease, if you're not sure of what impact it has, I can't stress enough, there'll be an option at the end to request a complimentary consult, or just simply a review of your lease. Have a look for any red flags. We're happy to do that for you. Another big takeaway, especially with COVID, is to now look a little differently and to say, right, what happens if something were to happen to me? So one of the main suggestions are to have something called death and disability clause. A death and disability clause, in essence, gives you or your estate the ability to terminate the lease if, heaven forbid, something were to happen to you, which again is so important. There's a devastating example of a doctor north of our office who is 43 years of age, built out a beautiful 6-operatory practice, and 3 weeks prior to the grand opening had passed away due to a massive heart attack. Fully built out practice, no doctor, no patients. Right? Guys, what's that practice worth? We don't need to liven up the chat here to know that it's zero. Quite frankly, it's less than zero. Right? The bank got their pound of flesh from the life insurance policy, right? And then suddenly the spouse was now responsible for, right, the landlord. The landlord went back to the spouse and said, unfortunately, Mrs. Smith, you're responsible for the roughly $9,000 a month, increasing at 4% per year for the remaining 9.5 years on the lease. It still irks me to this day, right? The reason why we get so passionate about this, was 30 years in the business, is because had that doctor had someone in their corner, right, giving that professional dental specific language and helping them out with professional guidance, they could have avoided all of these types of issues. From that perspective, right, in terms of some practical examples, we mentioned this before. Right, the option to renew. This is in 90% of leases. Be cautious about the fine print. Right? Take a quick minute and just look at what I've highlighted here. First off, right, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant, and if the tenant duly and has regularly paid its rent and performed all its covenants and obligations under the lease. Number one. Right? So, first of all, what does that mean? That means it's only good for Dr. Black. If Dr. Black sells it to Dr. Green suddenly is out of luck, Right? What might have been 32 years of term for Dr. Black means nothing to Dr. Green. Right? Also in default, we've seen things as simple as hours of operation cause doctors to be held in default and just simply not having the landlord allow them to renew the lease. In addition to that, look at the middle. Any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. Meaning simply that if, in the event, the doctor chooses to stay and renew the lease, who cares what you negotiated 5 years ago? Here's a brand new 99-page lease. Doctor in Honolulu, same thing happened. Right? Signed a letter of intent, suddenly got a 99-page lease and panicked. Right? And look at this, in no event shall it be less than the rent paid of the last year of the original term. So hang on a second. If, for whatever reason, we're going into a downturn, right? Recession, depression, who knows, right? But you've now lost the ability to renegotiate less, right? By exercising that option. So be cautious of these components, right? And this was an example, right? This was a doctor that had reached out to us in a panic. Right? This is a doctor who missed their option to renew deadline. Right? As you know, your lease expires November 14th, 2018. Pursuant to Section 2.4 of your lease, you had an option to renew your lease for 5 years. This is a doctor, by the way, who had just moved in 5 years prior. Right? However, you are required to give me written notice of your intention to renew no later than 6 months prior to the expire of your current term, which you did not do. Right? Please be advised that my broker will be placing a for lease sign, right, in a conspicuous but non-intrusive place, right, on the premises. So, needless to say, and that's what happened. The broker showed up, put a for lease sign in the window, and all the patients are looking around going, something going on here? Right? Relocation clause. So the last other example here, guys, is here's another one, just a doozy, that when looking at some of the components, be cautious. And in this particular case, the doctor only had 60 days notice, right? That the landlord had to say, you're out in 60 days. Right? And in that case, right, what you really want to have is something like a lights off to lights on. You want to make sure that there's a smooth transition, that again, you've got a nice piece, you're purely taken care of, and the day that you shut down on a Friday, you're up and running if, in fact, that your landlord really wants you to relocate, right? Be cautious, right, of what that rent will be for the new location. Is it the same? Is it a different layout, right? Is it more operatories, more income? Is it low? Is it a different layout, less operatories, right? More rent, right? And again, be cautious, because if you say no to the relocation, the landlord may and probably has the right to just simply terminate the lease and you're out. So they could force you to go into the basement. And there was a terrible example of a doctor that had basically a quarter of the floor, right? The landlord came up to renewing the lease. Doctor renewed their lease at ground floor rates. The landlord, unfortunately, had already secured a tenant for the full floor, a much larger anchor tenant. And knowing full well, they still signed the doctor up to renew the lease, and then the day after, gave them the relocation notice and moved them to the basement at the ground floor rates. Oh, don't let that happen to you. Plan, prepare, right, and ensure that you've got what you need to be successful. Obviously, in this particular case, the build-out of the new unit was fairly cheap, $175 per square foot, right? But well over $250,000, right? Plus downtime. And it's the patient attrition, right? It's the patients that for the day that you're shut down, they go down the street and they don't come back, right? So as we finish up, what's the solution to all of this? First of all, don't fall into the landlord's trap. This is what they teach landlords, which is to delay, defer, right? As long as possible, because the more you delay the lease renewal, the higher the leverage the landlord has. What's the best way to protect yourself? Start 24 months in advance, right? And it's typically what we find is the best opportunity. Draft a well-structured letter of intent, right? That contract, that check, right? And don't just say, hey, I watched this great webinar that Schein put on, and Eric told me, hey, you know what? Well, maybe I should just call up my landlord and start early, right? Don't start without a plan. What's the plan? Here it is. 27 years of doing this. Here's what we found works absolutely best. Number one, get all the facts and figures, right? Get all the documentation. If you have not reached out and have an executed copy of your lease, just email your landlord right now and say, hey, please send me a digital copy of my lease and any amendments, riders, exhibits, etc. And their admin should send it to you first thing in the morning. Get all the facts, know what you committed to. And if you bought the practice, know what you've now absorbed by assigning that lease. That might go back to all the way back to 1986. Number two, figure out your goals and practice goals. Number three, right, have your lease reviewed for risks, right? Find out and at least know, is there a relo? Is there a demo? What specifically might be in your lease that you might not be aware of? Number four, get the facts, right? Rental rate analysis, right? If you just want your demographics and rental rates, shoot me an email, happy to assist, right? Excuse me. Very helpful to really look at what market looks like for you today. And then number five, a proper negotiation is like a carefully choreographed game of chess. It could easily be 30, 40 plus hours, right? But it's worth it, right? It is your second largest expense behind overhead. So you want to be thinking 12 steps ahead. So don't talk to your landlord and share information about expansions, renovations, right? High-class problems, because the landlord can use that directly against you, right? So be very cautious, right? Go into it with a plan. But again, please don't skip steps 1 through 5, pick up the phone, right? And tomorrow morning say, great, Mr. Landlord, I just watched a great webinar. How much you want to charge me for my next lease renewal? Don't skip 1 through 5. Right? Have a plan, then, right, negotiate the financials, then negotiate all the business clauses. And quite frankly, the business clauses could cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars more than those financial components, right? And last but not least, don't stop until there's a fully executed form of lease. So 27 years of doing this is exactly the best way to help protect yourselves, right, your family, and beyond. So from that perspective, right, in appreciation of everyone's time, we waive our fee for what we call our critical dates and risk analysis. And if you've never had your lease professionally reviewed, trust me, now is the time. What our team will do is do a full analysis of the lease, right? In the background, pull up all the real estate reports, analytics, right? As well as then schedule a call with yourself, your partner, spouse, right? Whoever else may be involved with the practice. Right, and do the lease review with you, Zoom or either over the phone, and literally walk through some of the main red flags within the lease, and then talk about a bit of a negotiation treatment plan. We do that complimentary, right, as a benefit of our webinar here this evening with Schein. So from that perspective, my email is info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. We're bang on the 9 p.m. We'll go to some Q&A. I see a number of floated through, right, and to make it even easier, here's a quick poll, right? So again, for those of you that may not have had a lease review or simply want to schedule a time to discuss personally your specific situation, if you don't want to share some of the details, click yes for the lease review, right? And then happy to work closely and make sure that we have a proper solution for you. And at least a good strategy to figure out next steps. Right, so quickly here, we can see from the questions, yes, no, or I'm not sure. If your situation's urgent, right? And then number 2, I've just pulled up here, is the yes for a complimentary consult or lease review. So again, doctors, all throw it out to the Q&A. I see we've got a few in the inbox here, but don't hesitate to, first of all, hopefully feel a lot more empowered than you did coming into the course this evening. Number 2 is go into it with a plan. And again, the first step is to start thinking about all the questions that you might not have wanted to think about, but good questions about the business. Production per chair. Are you at $250,000 per chair, right? What's capacity look like? How does that look like with hours of operation? How does your revenue collections compare with your tenancy expense? Right? Typically, we see about 8.32% is national average. Those are a great components to make sure that you have the right data and facts to be making the right decisions. Okay, one of the first questions that came through here, Dr. R, if you are buying only a portion of the practice, partnering, do you need to review or renegotiate a lease? Love the question. So let me ask you a question. Would you feel comfortable buying in to 50% of a practice, yet having no legal right to enter the space of your business? So I think the answer is no there, but the main component is you really should. If you're buying into the practice, then you do and should, right, want to make sure that you are on that lease. Yes, it is some responsibility. Yes, you are making a commitment. Yes, you are then adding some liability, but welcome to business ownership, right? So quite frankly, if it is just the other doctor who is the named tenant, right, it's to your benefit, and probably even giving some extra covenants now to the landlord to be able to add you to the lease and probably renegotiate that lease, right? Because again, that lease, if you can't sell the practice because of that lease, it's much better for you to find that out now, Dr. R. And more importantly, right, if you're about to buy in, there's no point in buying in if there's not a clear exit. Right? And that lease will dictate what that exit looks like. So yes, you do want a seat at the table, and yes, you should have the lease, right, in both names with both partners. And quite frankly, you're probably not going to be able to do it without the landlord's approval anyways. In most cases, there's a change of control clause. So if you're buying 49% or 51%, in many cases, the landlords will want to approve that. So, Dr. R, I hope that was helpful. Feel free to reach out or send me a copy of your lease if you don't have it already, and happy to discuss that in a little bit more detail. Okay, Dr. H, what are typical costs to relocate a practice in the Bay Area? So, you're in the big leagues. You are in probably the highest tenancy market out there. But boy, has there been a lot of change. Security, homelessness. I used to live in Southern California for 6.5 years. It's changed a lot. So in short, it depends, right? But I know clients that are paying upwards of $400 per square foot now, and well over $1 million to build out a new practice in the Bay Area. But, right, there is no shortage of change right now. Silicon Valley, right, is cooling. There's so much commercial real estate, Apple and everybody else, Cupertino, et cetera, up the peninsula, right? All sorts of stuff gobbled up. That's shifted, right? A lot of people aren't going downtown San Francisco anymore. There's a big push to get people back, but you know, Elon Musk, everything else is all over the place right now. Bottom line is that could create some great opportunities for you, and locations you might not have seen being available, right, might have the landlord finally saying, look, I'm done with Silicon Valley and a bunch of, you know, call centers, et cetera. If they're all working from home, then you know what, I want someone that I can bank on in my space for the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, right? You might be surprised, Dr. H, what that landlord's willing to do, even in such a hot market as the Bay Area. But lots of changes, lots of challenges, as I'm sure you know firsthand. And again, we've done dozens and dozens and dozens. Our CEO's wife is from the Bay Area, and we've been very active there for the past few decades. So again, Dr. H, happy to discuss and have a look at and do some comparisons. And again, in many cases, that the first location you might be interested in is not the one you end up with. And don't let a great location be hampered by a boat anchor of a lease, right? It's one thing to get a great space, but if you get a great space that you can never sell or the landlord refuses to assign, what's the point? Hopefully that was helpful, Dr. H. Good. Any other questions? So hopefully now, I won't do the pulse check again, but you know, take this to heart. Right? Don't underestimate your value to the landlord. Don't let them paint you with that brush, Right? For those of you that own your own real estate, you're not out of the woodworks. Very important that you do have a proper lease structured in place. And look, you've just got through a global pandemic that nobody thought we'd see in our entire lives. Right? Now is the point to make sure that if, no different than your wills and estate planning, right, it's a perfect time to be thinking about the next step for your business, thinking of that Rockefeller kind of approach to build, expand, and contemplate next steps. Right? And truly, it's a privilege to help support each and every one of you through the craziness that is the commercial real estate market, right? And specifically your dental office lease. So on that note, I will pass it back to you, Ashut.
Thank you again, Eric, for the great presentation. If anyone has any outstanding questions, please email us at webinars@henryschein.com. As a thank you for attending, everyone who's here today will receive the recording via email in the next week. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Eric, and we look forward to seeing you guys again in the future.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.